if we're going to have negotiations with North Korea, the Secretary of State needs to be someone the President absolutely can trust.
Pompeo himself has been giving most of the daily briefings to the President, so that time together has brought them much closer than...
Mr. Pompeo in the past mentioned about regime change in North Korea, about possible military options.
Pompeo needs to fill out a team, and he has a very short timeline to do it.
And the situation has changed so much. I mean, the last time we had missile talks with North Korea...
Stakes here are very high. We're talking about nuclear nonproliferation and the future of the Korean Peninsula and issues of war and peace.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jang Cho. CIA Director Mike Pompeo is nominated as the next Secretary of State. Will Mr. Pompeo make breakthrough on North Korea as the top U.S. diplomat?
I've worked with Mike Pompeo now for quite some time. We're always on the same wavelength.
There is much effort all across the United States government to ensure that Americans don't have to feel at risk.
My guest today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining me, Mr. James Schoff, Senior Fellow in the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Schoff was a senior advisor for East Asia policy to the Secretary of Defense. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Frank, let me begin with you. Regarding the nomination of Mr. Pompeo as the new Secretary of State, senior officials said President Trump wanted a strong new team in place before talks with North Korea. What makes Mr. Pompeo fit for a strong team?
And I think the main qualification that Pompeo has that Tillerson perhaps lacked is the trust of the President. And that's essential going forward. If we're going to have negotiations with North Korea, the Secretary of State needs to be someone the President absolutely can trust. Remains to be seen whether the Senate will in fact confirm Mr. Pompeo. Already there's some rumblings that his confirmation process may encounter at least some difficulty, but I think that his qualifications won't be the basis for objecting to his nomination.
Mm-hmm. Jim, President mentioned that he was on the same wavelength as Mr. Pompeo. How similar are the two in terms of character and style?
Well, they come from pretty different backgrounds in terms of President Trump from New York City and Mike Pompeo from Kansas, but they're both businessmen at heart, and they're both, I think of themselves as straight shooters and not worried too much about politics and political correctness. They both are not happy with the Iran nuclear agreement that we signed and have taken some pretty tough stances against North Korea's nuclear development. So they've also spent a lot of time together since Pompeo became the CIA director. Pompeo himself has been giving most of the daily briefings to the President. So I think that time together has brought them much closer than Trump and Tillerson ever were.
Mm-hmm. Frank, yeah, Jim just mentioned about the daily briefings and the bond that the two has established. What is the influence or the position that Pompeo has within the Trump cabinet?
Well, you know, the CIA briefing job has such an important role in helping the President be informed. I think those daily interactions with Pompeo have shaped his worldview. It's a president who came into power lacking much experience in foreign affairs. And I'm sure that he has grown on the job through these briefings. I think, interestingly, Pompeo is not restricting his role only to providing intelligence. It's pretty clear that he has sometimes overstepped perhaps his brief by also providing some policy guidance to the President. And I think that it's not unique to Pompeo, but it suggests that if he is confirmed as Secretary of State, that he and the President will be mostly on the same page when it comes to foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add on this question of wavelength? I think they also share the sense that the United States is somehow being taken advantage of or disadvantaged by the global system, that we've given so much, and there's a Pompeo himself was not a fan of the climate change treaty and other types of international agreements. So that's another area where they seem to share a similar worldview.
I see. We just looked at who Mr. Pompeo was, and regarding his immediate task, I wanted to ask both of you, what will be his immediate task in preparing for the summit just 2 months away between Washington and Pyongyang, Jim?
He's got to get prepared for a confirmation, which means there's actually an interagency process of policy coordination that they need to do. He's got to pick some people to help him within his own staff and office, but also we have a lot of empty positions at high levels in the State Department that need nominations.
Well, I think Jim's right. You know, in Washington, there's a saying that policy is people and people are policy, and Pompeo needs to fill out a team, and he has a very short timeline to do it. He's not even confirmed. There's rumors that he may want to change the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Susan Thornton. There's vacancies within the East Asia Pacific Bureau. There's no ambassador to Seoul. And it's going to be really tricky to fill these critical positions between now and when President Trump is scheduled to sit down with Kim Jong-un. So I think the personnel office at the State Department and the White House is going to be working 24/7, trying to fill these critical slots so that they can prepare adequately for the summit.
Yeah, many people point out that vacant positions has to be filled, but you know, negotiations with North Korea, we've done this for the past more than 20 years, and it's all out in the open. You know, what's been discussed, what has been the, you know, back and forth. So can somebody with a solid strategy come in and pick up from there and just, you know, go to North Korea and have a good deal with North Korea, Jim?
Well, I think to some extent that's true in terms of we have a lot of history dealing with North Korea on this front, but that experience is not in this administration. And the situation has changed so much in terms of new leadership in Pyongyang with Kim Jong-un, who's never met another world leader that we know of, and the North Korean nuclear program has changed and evolved so much, much more diversified. The missile program is much larger and capable than, I mean, the last time we had missile talks with North Korea was in the 1990s. And the sanctions regime, the international effort to put pressure on North Korea is much more robust and, of course, multilateral through many UN Security Council resolutions. So the process of verifying, negotiating with an unknown partner, and rewarding, if you're trying to do action for action, it's a much more complicated process than we've ever had to date. So I think there's a lot of new dynamics that need to be considered.
I think there's also a personal dynamic that needs to be factored in. You're right, Yoon Jong, that the pieces of a deal are on the table. Many of them could be reassembled and put back together in a new configuration. But there's a personal element to any negotiations. The U.S. negotiating team with North Korea is going to be new. Whereas the North Korean team is the same team that they've had for 30 years. And I worry a little bit that the U.S. side is going to be at a distinct disadvantage in that they really aren't going to know the people across the table from them.
Right, but you know, who would have imagined that we would be talking about possible summit between Washington and Pyongyang? This was President Trump's very untraditional way of proceeding with the North Korean issue. So we're talking about this traditional way of dealing with North Korea, but could there be any strategy, good strategy to, you know, go and have a good deal with North Korea for Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Trump?
Well, gosh, you know, I think that kind of bold, decisive move, it's refreshing to see President Trump contemplate such a dramatic diplomatic opening. But the stakes here are very high. We're not talking about whether he's going to have success or failure in negotiating a new apartment complex. We're talking about, you know, nuclear non-proliferation and the future of the Korean Peninsula and issues of war and peace. So I am very skeptical that a kind of a freewheeling, off-the-cuff, impromptu approach is going to yield the kind of results that the United States needs.
Well, plus, I mean, our track record, we haven't had success yet. So for all of the closest situation we have, I think, was when former President Jimmy Carter went to Pyongyang and kind of negotiated a rough framework that led to the agreed framework and several years of negotiation. I'm not confident that the summit will happen. Certainly not in May, I don't think. It's too soon, and possibly not even this year. And that's okay from where I sit, because to some extent the idea of the summit is more important right now because it allows the South-North President Moon to have his summit with Kim Jong-un. And let's start there and see where we go, almost like stepping across the first stone across the river before we figure out where to jump. There's a sweet spot that everybody needs, and it's different than it used to be because this potential for conflict on the peninsula is much higher than it's ever been before.
Jim just mentioned about the potential of a conflict, and Mr. Pompeo in the past mentioned about regime change in North Korea, about possible military options. So considering this, if the talks fall apart, if the talks do not produce good results, what will be the United States, the State Department's next steps, Jim?
Well, it's hard to say, but the Pompeo selection certainly indicates Trump's confidence in him, and we do know that Pompeo has been part of the group that would say time is beginning to run out in the sense that North Korea's capability is becoming so dangerous to the United States, reliable, nuclear-capable ICBMs that can strike anywhere in the U.S. That seems to be a red line that some in the administration don't want to allow to cross. Perhaps we have rumors today that the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, might be leaving his post. It's possible he could become the next USFK commander. We've heard rumors that possibly a former USFK commander could be appointed as ambassador, and we could have somebody replacing the National Security Advisor, possibly John Bolton, who's also talked very heavily, frequently about using military force to compel North Korea to comply. So in a way, the U.S., at least Trump is, whether he means it or not, is kind of signaling through these personnel appointments.
Right. Before we go, Frank, how would North Korea react to Pompeo being the Secretary of State?
I think they'll deal with whoever the president chooses. I think Pompeo's tough rhetoric of the past will in no way disqualify him from sitting down with the North Koreans or being an effective diplomat dealing with the North Koreans. North Korean officials have pretty thick skin, and they haven't heard anything from Pompeo they haven't heard before.
Well, we'll end this conversation here and move on to our next topic.
북한이 못했대. 최초생과 사회적이나報道することによって
中方呢在半岛问题上立场很明确，我们坚持实现半岛问题。
러시아 양국과 우리 정부는 평화 안정의 모멘텀을 계속 살려나가는 데 협력하기로 했습니다.
President Trump's decision to accept a meeting with Kim Jong-un caught the world off guard. How are neighboring countries, China, Russia, and Japan, responding to the diplomatic opening? Now, Jim, Japan is moving fast. Japan is sending foreign minister to Washington, and the prime minister is coming next month. How will the neighboring countries try to stay relevant diplomatically?
Yeah, I think Prime Minister Abe and his team were certainly caught off guard by Trump's decision. I think Abe prides himself in having a good relationship with President Trump, and so that maybe set him off back on his heels a little bit. They really want to keep going forward with the maximum pressure campaign, and they're, I think, probably unnecessarily worrying that somehow the United States might cut a deal with North Korea that would deal with the ICBMs, but leave missiles and a nuclear capability in North Korea that could potentially threaten Japan. I don't see that in the cards, but they really want to feel out and especially with these personnel changes, who the people are and what the U.S. has in mind, and to get their viewpoint on sustaining this maximum pressure piece.
I think the Japanese are going to be rushing to catch up, but I think that they have to be worried about President Trump right now. I think the Japanese are learning that Trump's unpredictability, which may have helped to get to this point of talks with North Korea, can also be a liability in actually following through.
Frank, China says it will play a proactive and important role before Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. What proactive and important role can China play?
I think China is increasingly marginalized. The more that President Moon and now President Trump engage with North Korea, the less vital China becomes in the equation for the United States and for South Korea. And I think from a U.S. standpoint, that's frankly a good thing. I think the United States needs China's support for any agreement, because only China can provide the security assurances to North Korea that might compensate for the loss of their nuclear arsenal. But I think the United States and South Korea do not want China to dictate the terms of a deal with North Korea, because frankly, I think the Chinese are much more willing to live with a nuclear-armed North Korea than we are. So I think China, to be honest, is feeling a little left out right now. But from a U.S. perspective, I think that's just fine.
What will be the reaction of Russia?
Russia, that's interesting. Their leverage, I think, decreases a little bit in this dynamic. So we saw while the maximum pressure campaign was going forward, and even President Moon was on board, Russia, to some extent, was helping North Korea circumvent some of the sanctions, and I think mostly trying to gain leverage in this process. Now that Moon is back in the if not the driver's seat, certainly in the front seat of the car in this process, and with this possible Trump-Kim summit, I think their leverage decreases.
Jim, how is the multilateral talks, is it still relevant in these circumstances?
There's so little trust between the United States and North Korea and many countries in the region, that anything that gets agreed to in just a bilateral framework is so easily undone. And without this idea, I always saw the six-party talks as the concept of a jury, and that when there were certain things that North Korea had to do, if the 5 countries were unanimous in their blaming or putting pressure on North Korea to do something, that made a difference. And the same could be said, the opposite way. If the U.S. was really straying from the principles of spirit of an agreement, the other pressure from the other countries could help nudge us back.
Frank, is multilateral talk still relevant?
I think Jim makes a really good point about the role of the international community guaranteeing a deal and helping to keep the main parties on track, and I think that's valuable. I also think, frankly, the multilateral framework is a bit of a veneer or an umbrella under which the U.S. and DPRK bilateral talks can take place. The U.S. has sometimes been reluctant to give North Korea the full prestige of a bilateral channel, and so that multilateral setting enables the two to go off in the back room.
We'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. The photo today is the photo of the North Korean team arriving at the Paralympic Village in Pyeongchang, South Korea. Paralympic ends this weekend. Now, Frank, what's your reaction to this photo?
And I think it's so important that they participate in not only the Olympics, but in the Paralympics. And I'm struck that this represents a little piece of good news about North Korean human rights. Almost everything we know about the human rights situation in North Korea is bad, but seeing them honor people with disabilities in this way is a positive speck of light.
Jim?
Yeah, my initial impression looking at the picture is it's a very human moment, kind of in contrast to the very orchestrated cheering squads and other pageantry that we saw at the main Olympic event. So it looks cold, and it's not triumphant. And I agree that's a good sign if we get to that point, at least of the human element.
Right.
Here.
On that good note, we'll end here. Frank, Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. See you next week.